Thank you so much for joining this webinar today. Food for a Healthier Planet, expert panel on sustainability and nutrition. So for those of you who aren't familiar with Oldways, we are a nonprofit nutrition education organization that inspires people to embrace the healthy and sustainable joys of the old ways of eating. Heritage-based diets high in taste, nourishment, sustainability, and joy. Since 1990, we've helped people live healthier, happier lives by offering educational programs, resources, and recipes based on shared cultural food traditions from around the world. It's a mission we take great joy in and one with proven nutritional and emotional benefits. From the beginning, Oldways has focused on health, cultural traditions, and sustainability. What does it mean to eat in an environmentally responsible way? How can a population that may double by the middle of the next century be fed in a sustainable ways? And how can consumers who want healthier food and cleaner environment get the chance to vote with their forks? One of the most important lessons that we can bring forth from traditional diets is the lesson about sustainability. Traditional food cultures were much more resourceful out of necessity. People were careful to avoid food waste, used animal products in small amounts for both financial and sometimes religious reasons, ate with the seasons, and developed a delicious repertoire of mostly plant-based meals that nurtured both people and the planet. Today, many chefs are passionate about sustainable food systems, but that wasn't always the case. In the first Mediterranean Diet Conference in 1993, we had Joan Gussow and Kate Clancy talking about the Mediterranean diet and sustainability. In that same year, we also hosted a conference called Food Choices 2000, Sustainable Diets for the Next Century, and brought together pioneering chefs like Alice Waters and Rick Bayless to talk about chefs' role in supporting a healthier food system. It was at this meeting that we formed the Chefs Collaborative, a network of over 1,000 of America's most influential chefs working to advance sustainable food choices for the next century. Some of the programs of the Chefs Collaborative included strengthening farm, restaurant, and farmers market connections, which was radical in 1993, advancing sustainable food choices in schools, building interest in the new center of the plate, and advancing actions to change public policy on food, ag, and nutrition. A few years later, we worked with the UN to organize a conference on sustainable cuisine. In the years since, we have developed resources and events exploring diverse strategies for supporting a more sustainable food system, from aquaculture to responsibly produced cheeses to plant-based diets. As Oldways founder Kay Dunn Gifford wrote in 1996, it is important to incorporate widely accepted principles of sustainability into deliberations about diets for the next century. Today, nutrition and sustainability experts who have helped quantify these benefits, and you'll hear more about this in just a moment. So before we begin, I just want to go over a few housekeeping notes before I introduce our fantastic speakers. We will send you an email within 1 week with the CPU certificate, slides, and recording. So yes, this is being recorded and you'll get access to that via email within 1 week. We will have time at the end for question and answer. So please type those into the chat box in Zoom and we'll get through as many as we can. And then lastly, please visit oldwayspt.org/CPEU to learn more about our upcoming webinars and view previous webinars. And with that, I would like to introduce our two speakers for today. Walter Willett, Dr. Walter Willett is professor of epidemiology and nutrition at the Harvard T.H. Chan School of Public Health and professor of medicine at Harvard Medical School. Dr. Willett has published over 1,700 original research papers and reviews, including the groundbreaking EAT Lancet report, and is the most cited nutritionalist internationally. Sharon Palmer, the Plant-Powered Dietitian, is a registered dietitian and cookbook author with more than 20 years of experience in the field of plant-based nutrition and sustainability. She holds a master's in sustainable food systems and has a new book out now called California Vegan. So with that, I will turn it over to Dr. Willett, our first speaker.
Yes, thank you very much, Kelly. It's a real pleasure to be with you today. And I've been working with Oldways since the early 1990s, as you described the very beginning of Oldways, and it's been a great pleasure. This has really been at the cutting edge, in fact, ahead of the cutting edge, very often on really important nutrition issues. So today I am going to talk about whether we can feed the world a diet that is both healthy and sustainable. And that's been really an open question. Much of what I will talk about is from the EAT Lancet report that Kelly mentioned. This was funded by the Wellcome Trust, and that allowed us to bring together 35 scientists from 17 different countries from around the world. And that incorporated people working in earth sciences and agriculture and nutrition, social sciences. And that interdisciplinary work was really critical because this is such a complicated problem. The challenge we were given was, how can we feed what will be about 9.8 billion people in 2050 a diet that is both healthy and sustainable? That's a huge challenge, because even today, if we look around the world, we are very far from feeding people a healthy diet. We have several billion people who lack key micronutrients like iron and vitamin A, mostly poor children in developing countries. We have over 115 million children who are stunted and over 2 billion adults who are overweight or obese. And this, I think everyone probably tuning in today realizes that obesity is a very visible and huge public health challenge. The rates have gone up since the year 2000 very steadily. We have about 42% obese. And the important point is what this, even in 2000, was way out of control. When I started working on these issues in the 1970s, there were about 10% of adults who were obese. So about a fourfold increase since that time. This is not just an American problem. This is an issue in almost every country around the world. These are high-income countries up here, men, women, still increasing rates of obesity, but the rate of obesity is actually increasing more rapidly in low and middle income countries. So it's not just the wealthy countries anymore. And also, not surprisingly, we're now starting to experience the health consequences of the obesity epidemic. And they don't happen overnight. We first have obesity and overweight that itself directly, immediately is not an issue, but people develop diabetes and cardiovascular disease and the complications further of kidney failure, vision loss, amputations, et cetera. And so even before the pandemic, life expectancy was going down in the United States. And of course, the pandemic added a lot to that. The opioids epidemic has contributed, but the obesity epidemic is clearly a major part of that decline. And of course, the averages don't describe the full picture, because this is very uneven, and the effects are very uneven. Actually, the Latino population has had a better life expectancy than the white population in America, probably because they've, at least part of the Latino population has hung on to healthy traditions. But the African-American population has had a substantially shorter life expectancy. And then when the pandemic hit, life expectancy went down by about 5 years in the Latino population, about a year in the white population, about 3 years in the African American population. So the effects, for many reasons that I can't really go into, but diet and nutrition being part of it, have been felt very differentially in the various components of the American population. And it's important to recognize that this isn't inevitable, and it's not happening in every country in the world. This is looking at life expectancy in the high-income countries, and again, US going down, but Japan steadily going up, and actually France and Italy have done pretty well here. And Americans are now living about 6 years shorter on average than people in Japan, for example, and that gap is getting wider. So it's important, again, that this is not an inevitable epidemic that we're experiencing. And on the environment side, the picture is even, I think, more disconcerting. We've known for a long time that climate change was happening, but I think what no one really appreciated a few decades ago was the acceleration. It's not linear. We're going up at an accelerating rate. And at the moment, we're on track somewhere for about 4 degrees centigrade increase, which will be absolutely devastating to future generations. So how to take on this challenge and how the food system can relate to this is a huge issue. And after thinking about this for some months, the EAT Lancet Commission decided to break this down into 4 steps. First, to define a healthy reference diet. Everyone agrees we should eat a healthy diet, but when it comes to actually putting numbers on what that means, that gets a little more complicated. So we use the best available evidence from all sources, including controlled feeding studies, long-term cohort studies, and the few randomized trials that we had. Fortunately, our colleagues in earth sciences have been at work defining planetary boundaries. In other words, what are the limits, sustainable limits, that we could have for greenhouse gas emissions, cropland use, water use, et cetera. And then we applied a global food systems modeling framework to see what combinations of better diets, less food waste, and agricultural improvements could allow us to stay within a planetary boundaries by 2050. And then we looked at strategies, and I'll just barely mention that, and that can be talked about more today. I'm going to use protein sources as an example of how we looked at this, because the different protein sources have major implications for health and sustainability. We first started just looking at the composition of foods. And I think, as everyone knows here, beef has quite a bit of saturated fat. But what's not usually talked about so much is that beef has very little polyunsaturated fat, which is beneficial. And both N6 and N3 polyunsaturates are beneficial, contrary to some sort of myths out there that N6s are not good for us. Chicken has a good bit more polyunsaturated fat. Salmon's better, but if you really want to go to good PS ratios, then we need to go to plant protein sources like nuts, soy products, and legumes. And I think everyone here today knows that the PS ratio has been around for decades, because higher PS ratio does indicate benefit in reducing LDL cholesterol. Another kind of study we looked at were controlled feeding studies with risk factors, not disease, but cardiovascular risk factors is the outcome, and how different food sources could relate to those risk factors. Our colleagues in Germany have conducted a network meta-analysis that 66 randomized studies they could find, looking on effects of various foods on blood lipids, indicators of insulin resistance and carbohydrate metabolism, blood pressure, and inflammation. And then they created a risk score based on all of those outcomes. Not too surprisingly, from what I showed already, nuts came out the best, with the best score, legumes next, whole grains next, fish was good, fruits and vegetables, and then starting to get into foods that were not so good, but fine grains, red meat, eggs, dairy, and of course, at the bottom, sugar-sweetened beverages, because they have no positive health benefits. Another kind of study we looked at are the large cohort studies. These are the 3 large cohort studies our group has been conducting since 1980 to look at diet and health outcomes. The first was a nurses' health study. We started collecting data on diet in 1980 after some pilot testing for several years. And we've continued to update that diet every 4 years as we've gone along, because of course the food system's changing and people's preferences change over time. And so the advantage of this kind of study is that we can adjust for smoking, physical activity, and other variables as that might be confounding, as we want to hone in on one aspect of diet and look at a health outcome. And we've been able to document pretty much all major health outcomes that occur in this large cohort. That was women, 121,000, and we enrolled men, and another younger cohort of nurses, again, all women. So this is one example of data from the nurses' health study and our other cohorts combined. Here we're looking at percentage of energy from different protein sources, standardizing for 3% of energy from these different foods in relation to total mortality. This includes about 130,000 people who are healthy at baseline, and we had about 30,000 of the participants who died during the follow-up. So there's a lot of experience here and quite a bit of statistical precision. Whenever we're talking about a major component of diet, of course, we need to specify compared to what, because we do adjust unconsciously for our total energy intake. And so an isocaloric analysis is really appropriate. So we've adjusted for energy intake here and looking at different protein sources compared to the same amount of protein from dairy. That's the reference category here. Again, not too surprisingly, processed meat was the worst, then eggs, then unprocessed red meat, then fish and poultry were about the same as dairy. But if we really wanted to go to lower risk of total mortality, that meant plant sources should be emphasized that were significantly better than dairy or poultry and fish. But it's not just enough to say, well, this food is going to be better than that other food. We really did want to come up with numerical targets, and therefore we used the data on diabetes incidence, where the relationship between red meat here, as an example, is pretty linear. And this has been replicated in a number of cohorts from around the world. The reason for using diabetes, we had here with over 200,000 participants, over 13,000 incident cases. So we had a lot of data and tight confidence intervals. And we could see even going up from the first category to the second category, there was a significant, modest but significant increase in risk of type 2 diabetes. So we didn't want to have that number as our target. So we took a little bit arbitrary, about half of that number, which turns out to be at 1 serving a week of red meat. Now, that's not a precise number. It might be a little bit more, it might be a little bit less, but that puts us in sort of a reasonable target range. We went through this process for the various food groups, and I'll just run through them quickly here. For grains, a lot of flexibility, and we use this sort of as the trade-off for other components of a diet, keeping total calories the same. And we use 2,500 calories a day as a reference, recognizing that some people need more and some people will need less, of course. But the important point is that the grains be primarily whole grains. Potatoes have a less healthy profile, so we included them, but not as greatly emphasized as whole grains. Fruits and vegetables, this is pretty similar to most other recommendations. And then for milk, it's a little more complicated. People don't need milk. People around the world have done very well without milk in their diets traditionally. But we saw that up to about 2 servings a day of milk equivalents, that's about 500 grams a day, could be helpful. And so, but at 500 grams a day, we couldn't stay within planetary boundaries. So we kept that at about 1 serving of dairy a day. Beef, pork, lamb, as I already mentioned, about 1 serving a week, emphasizing a little more of the protein from animal sources could be poultry, eggs about 2 per week, fish about 2 servings a week, but emphasizing plant protein sources. And unsaturated fats is a predominant source of added fat, but a small amount of saturated fats could be okay. And we kept artificial sweeteners pretty low. This comes out to be about 35% of calories from fat. But again, there's flexibility. And for each of these categories, we've given a range with zeros for all the protein sources because a vegan diet is possible. But obviously then you need to emphasize even more the plant protein sources. But the important point is that there's a lot of flexibility here. And this has been called a flexitarian diet. I went through a lot of numbers here, but actually realized a few months ago that this boils down to something pretty simple and easy to follow. It's really 1 + 1, and most people can get that. That comes out to be, if you want to have some animal source proteins, about 1 serving of dairy a day, and then about 1 serving a day of other plant protein sources, with red meat being about once a week, and then on a base of nuts, soybeans, fruit, whole grains, vegetables, and plant oils. We did a nutritional analysis of this, and basically this looks quite good. I won't run through the numbers, but I did want to put a little flag here that I think dietitians recognize. If we go below about 2 servings of animal source foods a day, we can run into vitamin B12 deficiency, and certainly will run into vitamin B12 deficiency on a strictly vegan diet. So we need to keep that in mind. The simplest thing is to just take a multiple vitamin once a day, and you'll get plenty of B12 and other micronutrients as well. Is this realistic? The interesting point is it came out to be very similar to the traditional Mediterranean diet, which we know is very healthy because Greek men, as we looked at in our conference back in the early 1990s, Greek men had the longest life expectancy at that time. And they were consuming about 35 grams per day of red meat plus poultry. Our EAT Lancet reference came out to be about 43 grams a day. So it just happened to come out very similar to what the traditional Mediterranean diet was. But very importantly, and as Oldways has mentioned over time, most traditional diets actually have most of these elements that would fit very well with the principles of the Mediterranean diet or our EAT Lancet target numbers. For example, this is a meal from Vietnamese table, emphasizing here mostly plant sources, lots of vegetables. Here, brown rice, that's not usually consumed in Vietnam, but it goes quite well. And if someone wants some animal sources of protein, here a modest amount of fish. Sarah Bear Sinnott put this together with dishes from West Africa. This is a great peanut sweet potato stew. It tastes wonderful, really spicy and nice. And just that with the greens, in fact, could be a really good meal. These are all very flavorful dishes. Another meal from colleagues have put together from other parts of the world as well. So where do we stand around the world compared to the EAT Lancet targets? This red line represents those targets for red meat. Where you are here in North America, we're way over those numbers, but Saharan Africa and Southeast Asia, we're just about at that target number, or actually a little bit lower. But for starchy vegetables, much of Africa has too many. These are really poverty diets. But what's really important is most of the world would need to consume more fish, vegetables, fruits, legumes, whole grains, and nuts to reach the target numbers here, because those are gaps where there would be benefit with increases, as well as decreases of some parts of the diet in some countries. So what would be the health benefit of the whole world if the whole world moved to these target numbers? We used 3 different estimation approaches, but they all came out to be about the same, about 19 to 24% of total mortality, premature deaths could be eliminated, which amounts to about 11 million deaths per year could be avoided. Then we looked in the EAT Lancet Commission at the environmental impacts of various foods. And of course, these differ tremendously compared across different food groups. Red meat has about 140 times the amount of greenhouse gas emissions per serving compared to plant protein sources like soy products and legumes, with nuts also being very low. Pork, chicken, fish, dairy, eggs are quite a bit lower than red meat, but these are still 30 to 40 times the greenhouse gas emissions per serving as these plant protein sources. So basically, we need to shift from these foods to these more plant-based foods. And Sharon's going to tell you more about that. So we then looked at what would happen if we, to greenhouse gas emissions and other environmental impacts, if we implemented the planetary health diet targets. The planetary boundary for greenhouse gas emissions is about 5 gigatons per year. We were already a little bit over by 2010, and we're more over that number now. Our projections out would be, if we followed our present business as usual model, by 2050, we would be at about double the boundaries for greenhouse gas emissions. But if we adopted the planetary diet targets, we could get at about 5 greenhouse gas emissions. And if we further improve production methods and reduce food waste, we could be within greenhouse gas emissions limits and have a sustainable planet. So feeding 10 billion people a year a healthy diet within safe planetary boundaries is possible, and that would improve the health and well-being of billions of people. This could allow us to pass on to our children a viable planet. But this is clearly going to require the engagement of almost every person around the planet, and especially people involved in the health sector and education sector and food systems. So this is not going to be an easy task. And I greatly appreciate everyone who attended today, because we will need your help all the way along. Thank you.
Thank you very much. That was very fascinating. I'm going to be sharing my screen. So I'm going to be talking about how to put sustainable diets into practice. So as Dr. Willett was just talking about, there is so much research out there connecting our diet patterns to the health of the planet as well as our own health. But today we're thinking beyond, our own health to that planetary health. And as a dietitian, I'm really struck by the fact that we can't even really talk about nutritious, healthy diets if we can't even secure enough healthful food for everybody in the future. So this is something we all need to engage with. And, what is a sustainable food system? Well, it's a food system that is producing food using techniques that protect our environment, our wildlife, our natural ecosystems. It protects public health, communities, animals. It provides a safe, reliable, healthful food supply for the future according to individuals' cultural food preferences. And we are learning more and more that what we put on our plates can be the single most significant thing we do in our lifetime to reduce our environmental footprint. So as I mentioned, more and more people are interested in sustainability. And this is some work from IFIC. They asked consumers about what they believe in terms of their food choices impacting the environment. And 42% indicated that they believe food choices make a significant impact on the environment. It was 56% among online shoppers. So that's a great number of people who believe their food choices make a difference. However, many people did not know what that really meant in the shopping aisle. So they said if they could understand what these environmental benefits were related to their food choices, it would have a greater impact on them. So really educating ourselves, educating our consumers about how to make sustainable food choices is going to be a big project. So one of the things that we're looking at is the Western diet and how far we've come. So I wanted to start by, really looking at that Western diet. These are some photographs from the book Hungry Planet. I don't know if you've seen it, but this team documented these intakes of foods within people all over the world. This is a truck driver in Illinois and then a family in North Carolina, just to document what they ate. So I really think about this as illustrating the Western diet, which we know has been linked with negative health effects on human health, a higher risk of obesity and chronic disease risks, as well as environment. And our whole food system is kind of in this loop over the past 50 years of really producing these foods that create the Western diet. And when we eat these foods, we support that sort of agricultural food system as well. So not only is this diet high in saturated fat, it's high in processed meat, fast foods, highly processed foods. So it's high in saturated fat, sugar, sodium, but it's also low in nutrients. And it makes direct impacts in our communities on health and the environment. So there's also lower biodiversity in the Western diet, which means lower variety. And sadly, 75% of the world's food comes from only 12 plant species and fewer than 5 plant species. But we could be eating from 10,000 plus plant species, 2,500 animal species, and more fungi and algae. So we're just really, the Western diet really limits those food choices to just a small number of foods. And this agricultural method that supports the Western diet uses more fossil fuels, so it increases greenhouse gas emissions, and it speeds up that land use conversion where we're taking land out of natural ecosystems and putting it into agriculture. And at the same time, climate change is impacting the nutrition quality of our foods. Research is showing that seafood has less omega-3s now, crops have more carbohydrates as a result of climate change. Even our human metabolic processes has changed, favoring towards insulin resistance. In contrast, we could be eating beautiful, traditional, healthful diet patterns. And I'm a huge fan of the work that Oldways has done with their beautiful celebration of traditional diets. And these are some of their pyramids: Latin, the Mediterranean, the African heritage, the Asian diet patterns, pyramids. And when you look at them, you see similarities where there's this foundation of fruits and vegetables, seafood being the primary animal protein, lots of beautiful whole grains and pulses, limited amount of processed and red meats. And these sorts of diet patterns are linked with not only health benefits, but a lower environmental footprint. So this is a recent study that came out. I know you've looked at a few different studies, but this is another one I want to share with you that looked at environmental footprints of diet patterns. And they looked at land use, water use, greenhouse gas emissions, and eutrophication. Eutrophication is when fertilizers or manure runoff occurs and gets into bodies of water and creates dead zones. So they looked at the European dietary pattern, the Western dietary pattern, and the Mediterranean. Now, the European dietary pattern was similar to the Western diet, but it did vary depending on what part of Europe you were in. But it had some similarities, and you can see that it did better in some categories than the Western diet. For example, land use, but then it did worse in water use. Greenhouse gas emissions slightly better, but it did worse in eutrophication. But the moral of the story here is to look at the Mediterranean diet and see how much better it did, like, less than half for some of these parameters here. Water use was not significantly improved compared to the other patterns. But when you look at land use, greenhouse gas emissions, significant improvement. So in that study, they also looked at the different diet patterns and different food groups that supported those diet patterns. And I know you've seen some of this, but I wanted to show you how there's so much consistency in the literature. So you can see that on the first column is I'm trying to think, that is land use. Then we've got water use, greenhouse gas emission, and eutrophication. So you can see in all of these categories that the animal protein, are starting to do the worst here. The darker the red, the higher the impact, the deeper the green, the better impact, the lighter impact. So you can see that beef, pretty much did the worst. And you can see some of the animal proteins did better. But then when you start climbing down, this is the same chart. When you start climbing down to the plant foods, you see that they did so much better. And look at legumes. When we can compare legumes or pulses to those animal proteins, I'll switch back here. You can see so much improvement in these parameters. So it really just supports this idea of eating more of these whole plant foods. And this is another study that was done that compared different diet patterns to our average diet. And again, generally, the more plant-based, the better, but you can look at these different diet patterns and see that when they start getting away from the ruminants, the red meat, they start doing better. So just wanted to share that overall look. So one thing I wanted to talk about is One Blue Dot, which is from the British Dietetic Association. And it's some really brilliant work that they did in the UK, looking at the UK diet pattern, health concerns, environmental footprint, and making recommendations for the UK population to really move the needle in sustainability and health. So what they did is they came up with these recommendations. You can see that plate on the left, increasing fruits and vegetables, reducing red meat, avoiding processed meat, eating more root vegetables, whole grains, moderating dairy. And by doing these things in the UK population, they could reduce greenhouse gas emissions by 31%, land use 34%, water use 17%, and increase years of healthy life by 17.9 million, which is very significant for one country to do work like this. And the US does have a similar kind of a health profile and food system in terms of diet pattern. So this could be something that we could learn from. So when you look at this a little closer, this is what those recommendations look like. We've got the reducing of the red meat, avoiding processed meats, increasing plant proteins, soy, pulses, nuts, seeds, have sustainable sources of fish, dairy, moderate the dairy consumption, more whole grains, tubers. And when they talk about produce, they even get into seasonal, local produced, even using canned in the off season, and limiting those air freighted, because we know that air transportation is the worst in terms of greenhouse gas emissions. More portion control, in particular animal proteins and dairy, avoid those high fat, sugar, and salt foods. And they even talk about hydration, because hydration is so powerful in our choices. Tap water, unsweetened tea, and coffee should be the preference over soft drinks. And then food waste. They talk about food waste, especially fruit and vegetables, and then to recycle food waste. So I really love these recommendations, as well as the wonderful work from EAT Lancet. So these can be something that we can apply to our work. And this is similar to what Dr. Willett shared, but in the British Dietetic Association also put together this, where you look at the 3 different environmental inputs, because our protein choices can be the most significant thing we're focusing on the plate. So when we're trying to make more sustainable choices, looking at what's the protein can make a big difference. So you can see that those nuts, even though they do have higher water footprint, they have lower in greenhouse gas and land use. Then we look at these pulses, peas, dried beans, lentils, they all do so well, peanuts, soy foods like tofu, and then the environmental footprint starts climbing. But you can see even with an animal protein, some do better. For example, the poultry did better and the fish did better, and we just keep going along this spectrum here. And I wanted to just point out this picture of temporary beans. I don't know if you've heard of them, but they're an amazing bean that is grown in the Sonoran Desert. They are grown historically as a Native American food. They require very, very, very little water. They grow in this Sonoran Desert. And this is an example of some foods that we could start including in our diet that are so sustainable and also drought tolerant, which we need to be focusing more and more on. So pulses, one of the things I recommend is pulses. I recommend them every day, even though the dietary guidelines is saying like at least 3 servings a week. I recommend them every day. And I saw that Dr. Willett did as well in his presentation, at least once a day, because they really are one of the lowest carbon footprint foods. They're also drought tolerant. You can grow these pulses in, all sorts of harsh environments with low water use. This is a photo of fresh chickpeas at the farmer's market in Crete, right off the vine. They also have this amazing ability to deposit nitrogen, fix the nitrogen in the air, deposit it in the soil. So you don't need fertilizer. They're good for the soil. They can aid in food security because they're grown in developing nations where nutrition is needed. And they have that amazing ability to promote soil health, better crop diversity. As farmers rotate their crops, they can introduce pulses, have another cash crop, but also nourish the soil. So when we talk about feeding the world, how are we going to meet those increased food production needs? It has to be more pulses. Plus, they're economical, so they really do fit in all of those pillars of sustainability. Also, whole grains deserves more attention. They're one of the most sustainable food groups as well. They can be produced with minimal amount of water. They can grow in different climates. And I just wanted to point out that 75% of our global agricultural land is used for producing animal food in one way or the other, but yet it's only providing 17% of our calories. So we need to be using that land more efficiently for things like whole grains. They also improve soil fertility as we're rotating the crops. We're introducing that green manure back into the soil system. So we know that that's better for the soil too when we're rotating. So these are my tips for eating more plant-based, because a lot of what we're talking about is eating more plant-based, even if it's not a strict vegan diet, that flexitarian approach, including more plant proteins during the day. So these are my top tips I wanted to share with you really quickly. So one of the things I like to talk about is plant-based for breakfast. It could just be a default that all of our breakfasts could be more plant-based, you know? So there's so many options. It could be a whole grain porridge, it could be a veggie burrito, but really just making that the plant-based meal too. And then Meatless Monday is a great resource with tools and lots of inspiring information. But this idea that every Monday you start out with a plant-based day, I think is very powerful as we're moving more plant-based. And then you can include more plant-based days during the week. So one of the things I like to recommend is to shop for plants first in your mind. When you're doing menu planning, a lot of us think about the protein source, but what if we thought about all those beautiful plants that we're going to highlight? So right now I have lots of green leafy vegetables growing in my garden I want to showcase. So I might do a stir fry with lentils and brown rice. But just thinking about that plant food first in our whole menu process. Another thing is to use meat as a seasoning. And we see this in food cultures around the world where one small piece of fish or chicken is going into a big pot with lots of vegetables, grains, and the whole family eats from that. So that is a really great way to eat more plant-based. Include more plant-based pantry items. You know, a lot of the things in a plant-based diet are shelf-stable, economical, and easy. Things like beans, pulses, lentils, whole grains, making sure they're on hand so that you actually use them. And then cooking more often. You know, we're losing our cooking skills, but if you only had one day a week to try something new, let it be a plant-based recipe and start experimenting more. Keep it simple. A lot of people find plant-based cooking to be something intimidating, but it doesn't have to be. It could be like a chili or hummus on a pita bread with cucumbers. It can be very simple. Global flair. We've been talking about traditional diets, but some of the most beautiful plant-based cuisine comes from cultures around the world. So look at the beautiful foods from India, from Asia, from Africa, and let that inspire your cooking as well. One easy thing you can do is to take your favorite recipes and make them plant-based. So if you have a veggie lasagna recipe, for example, make it completely plant-based. Put in some more vegetables, put some white beans in there. So take your favorite foods and then just make them more plant-based. Slow cookers and instant pots are a great tool to get whole grains and pulses on the table quickly, so that can make it easier. You can try plant-based dairy alternatives. They have a lower environmental footprint. And finally, think yes. Don't think about what you're going to be missing when you're eating plant-based. Think about that amazing diversity in plant foods. There's tens of thousands of species, and it just opens up your diet rather than limits it. There are a few other things that I wanted to talk about for sustainable food systems. One is to target nutritious foods, because after all, if we are using all of our resources to produce foods, all of the inputs, soil, land, fertilizers, pesticides, to create foods that are low nutrient and actually increase our chronic disease risk, that is the opposite of sustainability. So when we aim for nutritious foods, we support a system, we support the farmers who are growing those foods. These are minimally processed whole grains, pulses, vegetables, fruits. These are the foods that should be the focus in our diet. And those low nutrient foods even take more energy. If you think about all of those ingredients being transported, processed, refined, they have a more intensive footprint. So another point is that even eating more than we need is a form of food waste. It's not sustainable to be eating more of the food that we need. Another thing we can do is to cook more nutritious foods. As I mentioned, you know, a lot of our cooking competence has declined and we're cooking less. Now, I know we cooked more during the pandemic, but now we're eating out more often again. And, you know, 33% of our calories are junk food. 90% of people in a survey said they don't cook. Yet, you know, the number one barrier for not cooking is time. That's the number one reported barrier. Yet, people on average are spending 2 hours a day on social media. So it is possible. And when we're eating out more often, especially when you're talking about fast food, takeout, just think of the amount of food packaging that is going into the landfill. 45% of our landfills are filled with packaging from food. 500 million straws every day, 200 billion cups a year. The average family eats fast food 150 times per year, which contributes 1.8 million tons of packaging. So just think about when you're cooking more, even if it's very simple, wholesome food, you're going to have a lower environmental footprint. And then food waste. We've been talking about food waste, and it seems to be low-hanging fruit because it just makes sense. You know, 30 to 40% of our perfectly edible, healthy, delicious food is going down into the trash. And this impacts the planet when you think about all of the resources it took to create that food, and then it's just simply thrown away. And this really requires efforts from all of us. But food waste happens mostly at the consumer level. So it's at our, you know, fingertips to really make a difference to reduce food waste. It's happening at home, restaurants, supermarkets, really close to us. So we produce enough food waste to fill the Rose Bowl. And I'm from Southern California. I've been to the Rose Bowl. It's huge. And we're filling that every day with food waste. If in that comparison, $165 billion a year, yet 12% of our households are food insecure. They don't have enough food. So this is really important. It's also generating greenhouse gas emissions as it's sitting in the landfills. So this is something we can all work on. Then also, I'm really passionate about eating seasonally, locally, because food is traveling a long ways in this country. So doing what we can to try to eat more seasonally and locally. Food travels on average 1,500 miles to get to our plate. There was one Swedish study that found the typical Swedish breakfast: apple, bread, butter, cheese, coffee, cream, orange juice, and sugar, traveled the circumference of the world to get to that Swedish breakfast plate. And another study found that one carton of yogurt with only 3 ingredients, milk, sugar, and strawberries, traveled 2,200 miles to get to the processing plant. So the more we can eat seasonally and locally, we can minimize that transportation, and food is more helpful when it doesn't travel so far. And eating more of these simple seasonal foods that don't require packaging is really part of that sustainable food system. We can support CSAs in our communities and our farmers markets, our local food system. And growing some of your own food. This is another one of my passions. It used to be part of traditions that homes had a kitchen garden and you supplied the family home with those locally grown foods in the backyard. So it's really one of the most sustainable things you could ever do to grow a little bit of your own food. You can just start simply with an herb pot and you can move from there. If you don't have land to actually grow food, you can start on a balcony. There's many options that can help you get going. If you do have some land, you can add more edible landscaping. You can plant shrubs and trees, fruit trees, blueberry shrubs, anything to get some food production. You can avoid synthetic inputs in your own garden. And if you don't have access to that land to grow your own food, you could do it in your community garden. Many communities have community gardens where you can actually garden in a plot of soil. So this is another thing you can do to make an impact. I also wanted to give a shout out for Food and Planet, which is a nonprofit organization that I co-founded with 3 other dietitians, and we're aiming to empower dietitians and healthcare professionals because we are a trusted voice in nutrition, and empower all of these professionals to become educated on sustainability and share these messages so that we can make a difference. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Sharon. We had a lot of really great questions coming in throughout these presentations. So I think we will get started with some Q&A, but thank you both for such wonderful presentations. I have a question here for Dr. Willett. Someone is asking about the EAT Lancet study and specifically the health outcomes. And they're wondering if BMI and obesity was the starting point of an analysis for health and chronic disease, or if you also were able to factor in like stress on various communities and if that played a role in assessing health.
Yeah. Well, no, we didn't use BMI as a starting point. We used major diseases like coronary heart disease, cancer, total mortality. This is the primary outcomes. And actually diabetes is a very important one because that often, as we sort of progress along the line from healthy weight to overweight to obesity, the first disease that usually shows up is diabetes. And so it's sort of a canary in the mine in terms of there's something really going on either for the individual or for a whole population that deserves attention. Some people have raised concerns about using BMI as an indicator, even though it wasn't our primary indicator for the EAT Lancet report. It's in concept, it's imperfect, but actually it works amazingly well. We've done a number of studies starting off thinking that BMI wouldn't work very well in predicting heart disease risk, but it actually works about as well as DEXA or underwater weighing, the classical gold standards. For an individual, of course, having also incorporating waist circumference and changes in weight since about age 20 are important to look at as well. But surprisingly, BMI is actually a pretty good indicator. But again, our endpoints were mostly on these disease risks.
Thank you. Sharon, we had a lot of questions about cost. And so could you speak to maybe the cost of pursuing a sustainable diet in lower income or food desert areas?
Yeah, this is a great question. I get it a lot. One of the things I think it's important to acknowledge is that some studies have shown that a plant-based diet can be lower in cost. So when you think about protein, a lot of times the protein is the most expensive thing on the plate. And when you're eating beans, they're the least expensive protein source. So, you know, that it can be a very affordable diet pattern. Now the produce, can be more expensive, but I think that's where we can help offer advice about making good choices. It can be, canned, frozen, it can be whatever is available. Seasonality can reduce the pricing. And then there are all these benefits, for example, SNAP benefits at farmers markets that people don't know about, these double dollar opportunities. So I think there's a lot of education, and this is a really important thing that we can do. Food deserts is a very real issue, and getting healthy food into food deserts is something we all have to be involved in. Community gardens, volunteering in a community gardens, getting a community garden in your region can make a big difference. This has been researched and it's shown that there's more access to healthful foods. So this is, I see there's education opportunities to really reconnect people to traditional healthful diets that are also affordable. And I know Oldways is doing a lot of work in this area too with traditional diets.
Yeah, I just add there that exactly what Sharon said, that there are a lot of vegetables that are oftentimes people think of produce as being very expensive, but things like carrots, winter squash, sweet potatoes, many vegetables, cabbage, actually very inexpensive. In fact, when the show's over, I haven't had lunch yet. I'm going to get three slices of whole wheat bread, peanut butter, and probably have a carrot. Probably comes to about 40 cents or something like that for a plant-based meal. Then takes about 3 minutes to prepare. How's that?
Pretty hard to beat. We have a question, Dr. Willett, because our food system right now is kind of set up to favor this Western diet approach. Have you and your colleagues identified any recommendations to maybe address changes in our food system instead of looking just at individual action?
Right, that's really very important. That that as individuals, we can make a difference, but we need to do more than that, and we also need to make it easier for individuals to have healthy and sustainable diets that are going to be mostly plant-based. Again, not necessarily entirely plant-based, and we can tip the table in favor of health and sustainability by economic levers. That we have lots of subsidies and taxes that actually favor animal source food production, red meat and dairy, for example. And we've shown for soda tax, actually quite a modest soda tax actually reduces consumption for that. So for really incorporating for something like beef, the true cost, what we pay is not the true cost. It doesn't pay for all the health consequences. It doesn't pay for the environmental damage. If we were really paying the true cost, incorporating that in the price, and then giving some subsidies for healthier sources of food, that could make a huge difference. So those are uphill political struggles that we need to do. Sometimes our institutions are doing it. Actually, our School of Public Health at Harvard is subsidizing healthy and sustainable food in the food service, basically, and sort of, again, tipping the economic table there to favor health and sustainability. So institutions, we don't have to wait for the federal government. A lot of institutions can make it easier to have healthy and sustainable foods next week, next year. We don't have to wait for the federal government. That is going to be the last thing to change, probably.
Thank you. Sharon, we have some questions about, in light of current issues with drought and increased temperatures, like this impacts farming. So do you have any insight on how we might increase production of plant-based foods, or how we can provide these foods that we know we should be eating more of?
It's such a complicated issue. I live in California and we're growing, most of the fruits and vegetables for the country. And we're the ones that, are in a drought year after year. If we had a more localized food system, then everybody could be producing. For example, lettuce is an example where it's mostly grown in California, but, in the summers, that could be a locally produced item. There's a lot of food waste, as lettuce is shipped around the country. And if we had a more localized food system, then, we wouldn't have the waste and those regions that have more water to support that growth. It's a very complicated system. But I do think that, when we really get back to more of these supporting your local food system can help with redistributing those water issues. It's going to be a really big issue. In California, we're starting to talk about major water restrictions, which is going to happen. Because of the farmers need the water. So this is something we can reduce the amount of water. When we look at all the things we were talking about, water footprint was in one of the environmental footprint parameters. And you can look at the food choices and see the water footprint. And, fruits and vegetables have a much lower water footprint than the animal food sector, which is, I think, a misnomer, because in animal production, we have to grow all the feed to feed the animal and then give the water over the lifetime of the animal. So they do have a larger water footprint.
Yeah, that's a great point about how a lot of our land right now is used that at least indirectly for animal production. So maybe if we were shifting more to direct plant production, that would feed people. That could be a potential avenue as well.
Right.
We're almost out of time here. So it looks like we might have time for one more question. Dr. Willett, could you comment on, we see that, fish is recommended or can be a part of the EAT Lancet diet. Do you have recommendations for people to maybe make a sustainable choice within that category?
Right, that's a really important point, that if you look at our report, the sort of the error bar, the confidence interval around fish and the greenhouse gas emissions and some other footprints is huge, indicating that there are some kinds of fish that have a major greenhouse gas emissions. You can sort of imagine chasing swordfish around the Atlantic Ocean with a big boat. You're burning a lot of fuel to get that swordfish. But on the other end of the spectrum are mussels, and basically farm mussels can be produced with very low environmental footprint. They actually clean the ocean, if anything, and you don't have to chase the animals around. They're right there growing on your rope usually. And you can buy them now frozen for quite reasonable price. We've been eating a lot more mussels, and there are lots of great dishes you can do. So, and then there's lots of opportunities in between, but for fish farming, which will need to double or triple the amount of fish. We can't increase the wild fish catch by much at all at this point. So this is an area that does require careful examination, careful choices, but it is possible to increase fish production and fish and seafood production quite a bit and do it sustainably if we're careful.
Thank you both so much for your time today. Everyone, check your inboxes within the next week. You'll receive an email with your CPEU certificate, the recording, and the slides. And we hope to see you again soon. Thank you.